This is the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. It is the largest continuous sand desert in the world, a sea of sand covering over 250,000 square miles. For most of recorded history, this landscape has been a byword for nothingness, an impassable void on the map. But the desert is not an empty space, it is a patient one. It doesn't destroy history, it simply covers it. Beneath the dunes, the desert waits. It holds on to the stories of travelers, the paths of forgotten rivers, and the foundations of cities. For centuries, the ancient world craved one of southern Arabia's most valuable commodities, frankincense. From Rome to Babylon, this fragrant resin was burned in temples and palaces. But to get it from the remote trees in what is now Oman, it had to be moved, and it had to cross the desert. A journey across the empty quarter would be impossible without water. Logic dictated that there must have been a central hub, a fortified oasis where the caravan routes met, a place to rest, resupply, and trade, before it was lost to time. For decades, historians and explorers searched, but they were looking in the wrong way. The answer wasn't found with a shovel. It was found from space. In the 1980s, NASA's remote sensing satellites pierced the sand, revealing the faint scars of ancient caravan tracks, all converging on a single invisible point. In 1992, archaeologists followed that map, and at a site called Shisar, they found it. Not a golden city of myth, but something far more real, a fortress, a community, and a catastrophe, all buried beneath the sand. If you enjoy the slow, methodical process of history and the patient work of uncovering the truth, find a comfortable chair. We're going to dig this one up, piece by piece. Welcome to Sleeping History.
Before a single shovel can break ground, before a map can be drawn, and long before a satellite can take a picture, there is the text. The search for any lost city doesn't begin in the sand. It begins in the library. It begins with whispers, recorded centuries ago, passed down from traveler to poet, from historian to merchant. But these whispers are not all a single story. They are a tangle of myth, memory, and data. When it comes to the story of a lost city in the sands of Arabia, we have two very different kinds of whispers. The first is the loud whisper. This is the one you may have heard, the whisper of myth and legend. This is the story of Iram of the Pillars. This legend is cemented in two of the world's most famous texts. In 1001 Nights, the Book of Arabian Nights, Iram is mentioned as a marvelous city, lost to the sands. But its most significant mention is a foundational one, in the Quran. In Surah 89, Al-Fajr, or the Dawn, the text asks, "Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with Ad, with Iram of the Pillars, the like of which was not created in the lands?" The text describes the Ad as a powerful, arrogant people, possibly giants, who built magnificent towers. For their wickedness and their refusal to heed the prophet Hud, they were destroyed. God, the story says, unleashed a furious wind, a sandstorm that raged for 7 nights and 8 days, burying the city and its people, wiping them from the face of the earth. This is a powerful morality tale. It's a story of hubris and divine retribution. And for centuries, this is what the world knew. It became a kind of Atlantis of the sands, a story that captivated romantics. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, was fascinated by it. He dreamed of searching for this lost city, which he believed was the key to understanding ancient Arab culture. But he was chasing a story, a myth. And for a historian, a myth is not a map. A morality tale is not a location. If we were to follow this whisper, we would be looking for a city of wicked giants destroyed by a magic storm. That is not the work of history. That is the work of treasure hunting. We at Sleeping History are not interested in the loud whisper. We are interested in the quiet ones. The whispers found not in poetry, but in ledgers, in maps, and in the margins of boring reports. The second whisper is the one that matters. It's not about Iram, but about Ubar, a different name, from a different source. This whisper comes from the ground up, the oral traditions of the Bedouin, the people who actually live in the empty quarter. In 1930, the British explorer Bertram Thomas was preparing to do the impossible, make the first documented crossing of the Rub al-Khali by a non-Arab. He was a surveyor, a geographer, and he was meticulous. As he traveled, he listened to his Bedouin guides. His guides, members of the Murra tribe, told him stories. They pointed to the endless, shifting dunes and spoke of a great city that had once stood there. A city of the odd people, they said, ruled by a rich and arrogant king, a city that God had punished and buried under the sand. The story sounds familiar. The mythological parts, the arrogance, the punishment, are clearly shared with the story of Iram. But the Bedouin guides used a different name. They called this lost city Ubar. And then they said something that was not mythological at all. They pointed to a faint track in the gravelly plains, a path hardened by millennia of travel. They told Thomas, "This is the Sikah al-Ubar, the road to Ubar." This is a critical distinction. A myth is a story, but a road is a piece of data. Thomas never found the city. He was focused on crossing the desert, not digging in it. But he recorded the conversations in his 1932 book, Arabia Felix. He wrote down the name Ubar and the existence of a road to it. A few years later, in the 1940s, another legendary explorer, Wilfred Thesiger, crossed the same desert. His Bedouin companions also spoke of Ubar, a great trading center swallowed by the sand. The oral tradition was consistent. For centuries, the people who knew the desert best insisted that something was out there, a place named Ubar. The name itself was a whisper, but was it on any maps? To find that, we must leave the desert and go to the very center of the ancient world. We must go to Rome in the 1st century AD. This is Pliny the Elder, a Roman author, naturalist, and philosopher. He wrote a colossal encyclopedia called Naturalis Historia, or Natural History. Pliny was a data junkie. He wanted to record everything. And, like many Romans, he was obsessed with the economy. Specifically, he was obsessed with how much money Rome was spending on one single, frustratingly expensive, imported luxury good, frankincense. To us, it's a nice smell. To the Romans, it was fundamental. It was the smell of the gods. It was burned in temples by the ton. It was an antiseptic, a perfume, a mark of ultimate wealth. And it only came from one place on earth, the remote, fog-shrouded mountains of the Dhofar region in modern-day Oman. Pliny was complaining. He wrote that the empire was draining its treasury, spending at least 100 million sestertians every year on luxuries from the east. He was particularly angry about the frankincense trade, which was controlled by secretive Arab kingdoms.
In his Natural History, Pliny gives us the why. He provides the economic motive for a lost city to exist. He describes the harvesting of the resin from the Boswellia sacra tree, noting that the locals claimed the trees were guarded by winged serpents. Pliny, a born skeptic, rightly guessed this was a story made up to scare off Roman traders from trying to bypass the middlemen. But then, Pliny gives us the data. He describes the trade route. He says the frankincense is gathered at a port called Mosha and then brought inland to a capital city, a journey of 8 stages. From that city, it was loaded onto camel caravans for the real journey. He wrote that the route north, to Gaza on the Mediterranean coast, was a trip of 65 stages by camel. Stop and think about that. A 65-stage journey. That's over 1,200 miles, straight across one of the most hostile deserts on the planet. A journey like that is not a casual trek. It is a massive, complex logistical operation. You need thousands of camels, you need food, you need protection, and most of all, you need water. You cannot, under any circumstances, just walk across the desert. Pliny's text demands the existence of a central hub, a fortified city, a safe place where the frankincense could be gathered, taxed, and loaded, a place with deep wells, high walls, and a large garrison to protect that wealth, a place exactly where the desert journey began. Pliny provides the motive. He tells us why a city must exist, but he doesn't give us a clear name or a precise location. He gives us the why. To find the where, we have to go to another Roman. This is Claudius Ptolemy. He lived in the 2nd century AD in the multicultural hub of Alexandria, Egypt. He was arguably the most important geographer of the ancient world. Ptolemy created an 8-volume work called Geographia. It was a stunningly ambitious project to map the entire known world. Now, Ptolemy's map is not a map as we know it. It is a list, a massive collection of tables listing over 8,000 locations by their latitude and longitude. He gathered this data from sailors, from merchants, from soldiers, from anyone who had traveled. His calculations were flawed. He thought the world was smaller than it is. His longitudes were often stretched, but his relative positions, the location of one town in relation to another, were often incredibly, spookily accurate. For centuries, his Geographia was the standard, but by the 20th century it was a historical curiosity, until a group of researchers looking for the frankincense trade decided to take Ptolemy seriously. They looked at his map of Arabia Felix, and they found it. It was not Iram, it was not Ubar. Ptolemy, in his list of the peoples of Arabia, identifies a tribe. He calls them the Iobarites. Let that sink in. A 2nd century Roman geographer, compiling data from traders, writes down the name of a people living in the exact region where the frankincense trade began. And the name he writes down is, phonetically, the Ubarites. This is the quietest whisper of all. Not a story, not a legend. It's a single entry in an 1,800-year-old database. This is the moment the mythical Ubar of the Bedouin and the data of the Romans collide. The oral tradition and the written record, separated by 1,800 years, are pointing to the same thing. The name Ubar was not just a story, it was a real place or a real people known to the most meticulous geographer of the ancient world. Ptolemy didn't stop there. On his map, in that same region, he lists several locations. He lists a coastal port, Moshe Liman, the same port Pliny mentioned. He lists the Sapphirite people, and he lists an inland site, a Manteon, which can be translated as a well or oracle, a significant source of water. This is the whisper that matters. Let's assemble the facts as a sleeping history historian would do. We must discard the myth of Iram. It is a magnificent story, but it is not evidence. What we have is a set of verifiable, quiet, boring facts. The motive from Pliny, a fantastically wealthy frankincense trade beginning in the 1st century AD that required a fortified logistical hub at the edge of the desert. The oral tradition from Thomas, a persistent, centuries-old local Bedouin legend of a lost city named Ubar and a physical road said to lead to it. And the data from Ptolemy, a 2nd century Roman map that lists a people called the Iobarites, the Ubarites, living in that exact region. The whispers are not one voice, they are a chorus, an economic report from Rome,
a fireside story from a Bedouin tent, and a line of data from a library in Alexandria. All of them, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, are pointing to the same small, empty patch of the Rub al-Khali. The texts had given the 20th century an economic motive, a name, and a set of coordinates. The whispers were done. The next step was to see if modern technology could turn those whispers into a solid line on a map.
The whispers were there. The texts, the maps, and the oral traditions all pointed to a single, tantalizing idea, a hub for the frankincense trade, buried at the edge of the empty quarter. For most of the 20th century, this is where the stories stalled. Explorers like Bertram Thomas and Wilfred Thesiger were men of incredible endurance. They could cross the desert, they could survive it, and they could document the cultures that lived within it. But they were, in a way, like sailors on an ocean. They could only see the surface. The desert sand, like the ocean's water, hides its secrets in the deep. They could walk directly over the ruins of a city and never know it was there. The Bedouin guides could point to the road to Ubar, but these tracks were faint, scattered, and often disappeared, swallowed by the same dunes that claimed the city. To find a single, specific, buried location in 250,000 square miles of shifting sand was not a question of endurance. It was a question of data. The searchers and the whispers were waiting for a new kind of tool. The modern search does not begin with a rugged adventurer, but with a filmmaker and amateur historian in Los Angeles, Nicholas Clapp. In the early 1980s, Clapp was, like many before him, captivated by the story. He had read Bertram Thomas's 1932 book, Arabia Felix. He was struck not by the myth of Aram of the Pillars, but by the quiet, factual observation from Thomas's Bedouin guides. This is the road to Ubar. Clapp was not a treasure hunter. He was a documentarian. He approached the problem with a new kind of thinking. He wasn't looking for a city of gold. He was looking for a logistical hub. He read the same texts we discussed in Part 2, Pliny's Natural History and Ptolemy's Geographia. He formed a simple, powerful hypothesis. If Ubar was the central collection point for the frankincense trade, as Pliny's economics demanded, and if it was located at the coordinates that Ptolemy's data suggested, then it must have been the center of a massive transportation network. All the caravan routes from the north, south, east, and west would have had to converge on this one single spot, the only reliable source of water for hundreds of miles. The problem, then, was not to find the city. The problem was to find the roads. The city was just a dot. The roads were a vast network of lines, all pointing to the dot. If he could find the lines, they would lead him to the center. But how do you find roads that have been buried under the sand for 1,500 years? Clapp, along with his partner, a lawyer named George Hedges, looked to the sky. This was the 1980s, the dawn of the public space age, and they turned to the one organization that might have the tools to see the invisible: NASA. They contacted the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, in Pasadena, California. Their request was unusual, but it landed on the desk of a scientist who was uniquely positioned to understand it, Dr. Ronald Blom. Blom was a geologist at JPL. His job was to look at remote sensing data, pictures from space, to understand the Earth's surface. When Clapp and Hedges presented their research, Blom was intrigued. The historical data, the maps from Pliny and Ptolemy, was so specific it gave him for the first time a defined, limited area to search. The hunt began. The first tool they used was Landsat. Landsat is, in simple terms, a highly advanced camera in space. It captures light in different parts of the spectrum, including visible and infrared. It is excellent at seeing large-scale features. Dr. Blom and his team processed the Landsat images of the Dhofar region, and, faintly, they began to see them. The images showed subtle, almost imperceptible changes in the color and texture of the desert surface. These were the scars of old tracks, so vast they could not be seen from the ground, but visible from orbit. The faint lines showed where thousands of years of camel traffic and more recently Bedouin trucks had compacted the soil, changing the way it held moisture and reflected light. The Landsat images were a proof of concept. The roads were there. They were visible. But Landsat had a limitation. It's an optical system. It's a camera. It can only see the surface. Where the dunes had completely covered the tracks, Landsat was blind. It showed parts of the roads, but the lines were broken. They were still just fragmented whispers.
The team needed a tool that could see through the sand. The answer came from the Space Shuttle Challenger. In 1981 and again in 1984, the shuttle carried a revolutionary instrument into orbit. It was called Shuttle Imaging Radar, or SIR. The second mission was designated SIR-B. This was not a camera. It was a radar system. Here is how it works. A camera, like Landsat or your own eyes, is a passive sensor. It just collects the sunlight that is already bouncing off an object. Radar is an active sensor. It creates its own signal. It fires a beam of microwave energy at the ground, and then it listens for the echo that bounces back. This has two major advantages. First, it can see perfectly, day or night, and it can see right through clouds. But its second advantage, in this specific case, was the key. The surface of the empty quarter is one of the driest places on Earth. It is hyper-arid. The sand is so dry, so utterly lacking in moisture, that it is essentially invisible to radar. When the SIR-B signal hit the desert, it didn't bounce off the top layer of sand. It penetrated it. It passed straight through the sand, through the dunes, as if they weren't there. The radar waves kept going, a foot, 5 feet, 10 feet down, until they hit something different. They bounced off the solid, ancient, underlying bedrock. And crucially, they also bounced off anything else solid that was buried in the sand, like the compacted earth of a 1,500-year-old road. When Dr. Ronald Blom processed the radar data, the whispers became a shout. The images were stunning. They were a ghost map. Buried under meters of sand, the shuttle's radar had revealed the entire network of fossil caravan routes. These were not the modern truck tracks. These were the ancient highways packed down by millions of camel hooves over 1,000 years. The radar had done what no explorer on the ground could. It had peeled back the desert. And the tracks did exactly what Nicholas Clapp had hypothesized. They were not random. They came from the north, from the south, and from the east, and, like the spokes of a giant wheel, they all converged on one single, solitary point. That point was an existing, known, but largely ignored location. It was a place where a 19th century Omani fort stood in ruins, a place that still had a working well. The locals, in their oral tradition, knew this place. They had a name for it. They called it Shizr. The satellite data had given them a target, a high-tech X on a treasure map. The name Ubar was still a question. As Dr. Juris Zarens, the lead archaeologist who would join the project, often pointed out,
Ubar, or Iobarite, in Ptolemy's text, likely referred to a region or a people, not a single city. But Shizr was a place, and it was the only place in this entire sector of the desert that had water. The modern search, the high-tech search, was over. It had succeeded. The team now had a set of coordinates backed by data from NASA and a direct line back to the texts of Pliny and Ptolemy. Now they had to go to the ground. In 1990 and 1991, Clapp and Hedges, now joined by Dr. Zarins and the British explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes for his desert crossing expertise, mounted small expeditions. This was not archaeology. This was reconnaissance. This was ground truthing. They were for the first time following the map that the radar had given them. They drove out to the coordinates. They found the desolate well at Shizr, and they began to walk the surface. Almost immediately, they found their proof. They found pottery, not simple local pottery. They found shards of 1st to 4th century Roman terra sigillata, a common red-gloss tableware from across the empire. They found shards of Greek pottery. They found bits of Syrian glass. This was not a remote Bedouin campsite. This was not a simple 19th century fort. This was an international trading post. This was the exact kind of material evidence you would expect to find at the logistical hub Pliny had described. A place where caravans, loaded with frankincense, stopped and traded with merchants from the wider Roman, Persian, and Greek worlds. The texts had provided the why. The satellite had provided the where. And now a few handfuls of broken pottery lying on the surface of the sand provided the when. The modern search was complete. The team had found their target. They had the evidence, they had the location, and they had the backing of history. The next step was to trade the satellites and the jeeps for brushes and trowels. The next step was to dig. The modern search was over. Nicholas Clapp and George Hedges had used satellite imagery to pinpoint a target. Juris Zarins had confirmed its archaeological potential with surface finds. All the data, from ancient Roman texts to modern radar, converged on this single, unassuming spot in the Omani desert, Shizr. Now, the true work began. Archaeology is often portrayed as a dramatic treasure hunt. In reality, it is meticulous, slow, and often frustrating. It is about careful documentation, scientific analysis, and the patient removal of layers of time. The team that gathered at Shizr in December 1992 was ready for this grind. The core archaeological team was led by Dr. Juris Zarins, an American archaeologist specializing in the Near East, particularly the Arabian Peninsula. He was a perfect fit, having spent years studying the ancient history of Oman and Yemen. His skepticism of romantic myths and his insistence on rigorous methodology were exactly what this project needed. With him were a small group of specialists, local Omani workers, and logistical support from people like Sir Ranulph Fiennes and his team. The initial assessment of the site was complex. The most prominent feature was a large irregular depression, a sinkhole, in the center of the area. Around it, the ruins of a small mud-brick fort from the 19th or early 20th century were visible. The surface was littered with pottery shards, the same kind of international wares that Zarins had found during his reconnaissance. This suggested human activity over a very long period, but what exactly was buried beneath? The first task was to establish a grid. This is standard archaeological practice. Divide the entire site into precise squares. Every find, every layer of soil, every feature would be recorded in relation to this grid. It ensures that the excavation is systematic and that the context of each artifact is preserved. The team began to dig, not with bulldozers, but with trowels, brushes, and sometimes even teaspoons. Their initial focus was around the central sinkhole and beneath the visible mud-brick fort. They knew that human settlements often grew up around a primary resource, in this case, the well that fed the sinkhole. Slowly, carefully, they peeled back the layers of sand and debris. This is the essence of archaeology, digging back through time. The upper layers represented more recent activity, like the 19th century fort. Beneath that, they expected to find older structures. And they did. As they meticulously removed the desert's accumulated dust, the first solid evidence of a much older structure began to emerge. These were not grand palaces, but solid, well-built stone walls. These walls were far more substantial than the later mud-brick fort. They were built with large, cut stones, indicating a significant investment in construction. The walls formed a large, irregular polygon, encompassing an area of about 50 by 80 meters, and their purpose was clear: defense. These were fortress walls, suggesting a strategic and valuable location that needed protection. This was no mere village, this was a stronghold. But the real discovery wasn't just the walls, it was how they were built and what they surrounded. The walls were constructed around the central sinkhole, essentially making the well the heart of the fortress. This was a clever defensive strategy. Control the water, control the site. As they dug deeper, they discovered multiple phases of construction. The visible mud-brick fort was just the latest iteration, built atop the ruins of something much, much older. Beneath the mud-brick walls, they found the formidable stone walls of an earlier structure, and beneath those, even older foundations. This layering of structures told a story of continuous occupation, of rebuilding upon previous foundations, stretching back into antiquity. Every scoop of soil was sifted, every fragment was scrutinized, and the artifacts began to tell their tale. Pottery was the most common find, and it was invaluable for dating. The team found quantities of pottery from the Persian period, roughly 550 to 330 BC, the Hellenistic period, 330 to 30 BC, and significant amounts of Roman and late Roman pottery, 1st to 4th centuries AD. They also found Islamic-era pottery, confirming continuous occupation. This wasn't just local wear. The archaeologists found shards of terra sigillata from the Roman Empire, evidence of trade with the Mediterranean world. They found fragments of South Arabian incised ware, indicating connections with the other kingdoms of ancient Arabia. And they found finely crafted pottery imported from Persia.
These artifacts painted a clear picture. Shisar was not isolated. It was deeply connected to the broader ancient world, a crossroads of trade and culture. Beyond pottery, other critical finds emerged. Coins, small, often corroded but vital. They found coins from various periods, including Roman and Parthian, Persian examples. Coins provide precise dates, confirming the periods of intense activity at the site. These pieces of metal, once everyday currency, were direct evidence of trade and economic interaction with powerful empires. They also uncovered other everyday items: stone tools, grinding stones for processing grain, bronze implements, and fragments of glass. These weren't glittering treasures, but they were far more valuable to an archaeologist. They were the tangible remnants of daily life, offering glimpses into the lives of the people who inhabited this remote desert outpost. As the excavation progressed, the plan of the ancient fortress became remarkably clear. It was a well-fortified, polygonal structure, roughly 50 meters by 80 meters. Its walls, made of dressed stone, were thick, up to 3 meters in places, and featured projecting towers at the corners, clearly designed for defense against attack. Inside the walls, they found evidence of domestic structures, storage areas, and, most importantly, the central well that fed the sinkhole. This was the lifeline of the fortress, and its position, enclosed within the stout walls, highlighted its supreme importance. The fortress, the coins, the pottery, all pointed to a continuous narrative. From at least the late Bronze Age, around 1300 BC, and certainly by the Iron Age, around 800 BC, this strategic location was settled. It served as a critical oasis and defensive point, likely associated with the Iobarite people, mentioned by Ptolemy, who controlled the vital water sources and the caravan routes. The heyday of the fortress, however, was clearly linked to the frankincense trade, flourishing from the 1st century BC through the 4th century AD. This was the period when Roman demand for frankincense was at its peak, and Schisser stood as a crucial node in that vast network. Then came the dramatic twist. The true discovery was not just the city, but its fate. Beneath the later layers, around the very heart of the fortress, the well, the archaeologists discovered evidence of a catastrophic collapse. The central part of the fortress, including the well, had quite literally fallen into the earth. The immense weight of the fortress walls, built on a geological fault line above an ancient limestone cave system, proved too much. The constant draw of water over millennia had gradually eroded the underlying limestone, creating a massive void. Eventually, the roof of that void gave way. The central tower of the fortress, along with parts of the surrounding wall, had plunged into a newly formed massive sinkhole. The discovery revealed human remains tangled with the debris, evidence that people were caught in the catastrophic event. This was not a mythical sandstorm. This was geology. This was the sudden, brutal end for a significant part of the fortress. The dating of the artifacts found within this collapsed layer placed the event sometime in the 4th century AD. This coincided precisely with the documented decline of the frankincense trade as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, reducing demand for pagan incense rituals. The discovery at Schisser was profound. It wasn't the Irem of the Pillars of legend, with its wicked giants and divine retribution. It was something far more historically significant, the tangible remains of the frankincense trade's lost logistical hub, likely the true Ubar. The systematic excavation, the careful analysis of pottery and coins, and the geological evidence had revealed a powerful story, a story of human ingenuity in a harsh environment, of a vital nexus connecting the ancient world, and of a natural catastrophe that brought its prominence to an end. The desert had revealed one of its deepest secrets, and the story of the ancient city, now brought back to light, was ready to be told.
This is what the archaeologists found: foundations, collapsed walls, and pottery shards. The skeleton of a city. But for 3 or 4 centuries, this place was not a skeleton. It was a living, breathing, and vital organism. To understand it, we must put the flesh back on these bones. We must rewind the clock, past its catastrophic collapse, past its slow decline, and back to its prime. We are in the 1st century AD. In Rome, Augustus has established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The empire is stable, wealthy, and insatiably hungry for a single, fragrant commodity. This is the world that built Schisser. But first, what do we call it? The texts are confusing. The Bedouin oral tradition, as we heard, called the lost city Ubar. Ptolemy, the 2nd century geographer, labeled the people of this region the Iobaritae, the Ubarites. The myth, which we are not following, called it Iram. The archaeological site itself, the one with the well, is known today as Shisar. What its inhabitants called it in the 1st century AD is lost to history. It may have been Ubar. It may have been a local name now forgotten. For the sake of clarity and fact, we will refer to this site by its archaeological name, Shisar, and understand that it is the real historical nucleus of the Ubar legend. Its prime, from roughly the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD, was not defined by its size. This was not a sprawling metropolis like Alexandria or Antioch. It was something far more specialized. It was a machine, a fortified logistical machine built for one purpose: to control the water and monopolize the trade. Let us first look at the machine's architecture. The excavation in 1992 revealed a polygonal fortress, roughly 50 by 80 meters. The outer walls were formidable, built not from mudbrick, but from cut and dressed limestone blocks. In places, they were up to 3 meters thick. This was not a token wall. It was a serious defensive statement. At the corners, the archaeologists uncovered the foundations of projecting towers. From these vantage points, soldiers could see for miles across the flat gravel plain. More importantly, they could use crossfire to defend the base of the walls from any potential attackers. And there would have been attackers. Not Roman legions, but rival tribes, bandits, and raiders. The cargo passing through Shisar was, ounce for ounce, among the most valuable in the world. The fortress was a vault, and its walls were the first line of defense. To enter, you would pass through a single, heavily guarded gate. This was the point of control. This is where tariffs were collected, where weapons were registered, and where the fortress administrators, the Iobaritae, could decide who came in and who stayed out. Inside, the courtyard was not filled with grand temples or palaces. It was a functional, working space. Archaeologists found the foundations of domestic quarters, barracks for the garrison, and most critically, large-scale storage areas. This is where the goods were kept safe from the sun and from thieves. But the true heart of the fortress, the very reason for its existence, was not a building. It was a hole in the ground, the well. The site at Shisar sits on a geological quirk. It is a natural karst, a place where underground water has dissolved the limestone, creating a cave system and, crucially, a reliable, permanent source of fresh water. It was the only such source for over 100 miles in any direction. The fortress was built around this well. The well was in fact inside a fortified central tower. To control Shisar was to control this well, and in the Rub al-Khali, to control the water was to control everything. No caravan, no matter how large, could begin the 1,200-mile journey north without first stopping here. This water was the fortress's ultimate leverage. It was the source of all its power and all its wealth. So, who lived in this machine? First, there was the permanent garrison. These were the local Iobaritae, the people Ptolemy named. They were soldiers, administrators, and tax collectors. They maintained the well, patrolled the walls, and managed the flow of goods. Their language would have been an ancient South Semitic language, a relative of those spoken in the kingdoms of Yemen. They would have been hardy, practical people, adapted to the harshness of the desert. Second, there were the caravan masters and the Bedouin. These were the men who actually moved the goods. They were the long-haul truckers of the ancient world. They bred and raised the dromedary camels, the only animals capable of this journey. They knew the routes, the stars, and the subtle signs of the desert. They would have arrived at Shisar with their camels, rested them, watered them, and prepared them for the grueling, empty quarter crossing. Their relationship with the fortress garrison would have been one of mutual, and sometimes tense dependence.
Third, there were the merchants. This is where the international artifacts come in. When archaeologists found shards of Roman terra sigillata pottery, they were finding the ancient equivalent of a discarded Starbucks cup. This common, mass-produced redware meant that Romans, or at least people fully integrated into the Roman economy, were here. They were not tourists. They were buyers, agents, and merchants, sent from coastal cities or from as far away as Alexandria or Gaza. They were here to inspect the product, negotiate prices, and pay for the shipments that would eventually land in Rome. So in the central courtyard on any given day, you would hear a mix of languages: the South Arabian of the garrison, the nomadic dialects of the Bedouin, and the lingua franca of the Roman trade, Koine Greek, and perhaps some Latin. And what was this product? Why all this effort? Why build a fortress in the middle of nowhere? Frankincense. To the modern world, it is a pleasant smell, a minor part of religious ceremonies or perfumes. To the Roman world, it was fundamental. It was burned by the ton in temples as the primary offering to the gods. The word perfume itself comes from the Latin perfumum, through smoke. It was an antiseptic, used in medicine to clean wounds. It was a disinfectant, burned to cover the stench of urban life and death. It was a symbol of wealth, status, and divine favor. And it came from only one place, the Boswellia sacra trees that grow in the remote, fog-draped Dhofar Mountains just south of Shisar. The trade was a farm-to-market operation on an epic scale. Step 1, the harvest. Local tribes would move into the mountains, scrape the bark of the trees, and wait for the resin to bleed out and harden into tears. This was a difficult, labor-intensive process, shrouded in mystery. Pliny the Elder wrote that the locals claimed the trees were guarded by winged serpents, a story he rightly guessed was meant to scare off Roman middlemen. Step 2, the consolidation. The harvested resin was brought inland from the humid mountains to the dry desert edge, to one single collection point, Shisar. This was Shisar's primary function. It was the grand entrepot, the central warehouse. Here the frankincense was gathered, sorted by quality, weighed on bronze scales, and bagged. Here, the Roman merchant, having traveled for months, would finally see the product, argue over the price, and pay for it with bags of silver coins. Step 3, the caravan. Once a massive shipment was ready, a great caravan would be assembled. This was a massive undertaking, involving hundreds, perhaps thousands of camels, and dozens of armed guards. This is the scene we must imagine. The central courtyard of Shisar, chaotic and loud, the sound of braying camels, the shouting of men in multiple languages. The dry, dusty air is suddenly cut by the sharp, piney, citrus-like scent of frankincense being loaded. The caravan masters would then lead this train, this river of wealth, out of the fortress gates. They would follow the roads to Ubar, the faint tracks captured by the satellites, heading north. For 65 stages, as Pliny reported, they would walk, over 1,200 miles across the empty quarter, until they reached the ports of Gaza, where the frankincense would be loaded onto ships bound for Rome. Let's reconstruct a single day in the prime of Shisar in 150 AD. Dawn. The sun's first light hits the top of the eastern tower. The fortress gates, sealed all night, are opened. The night watch is replaced.
From the well, the sound of ropes and buckets is already audible as troughs are filled for the animals. Morning. The heat is still bearable. This is the time for work. In the courtyard, a local artisan sits cross-legged, mending a leather saddle. A Roman agent argues with a Yobarati official over the weight of a shipment, using a set of bronze balance scales. Soldiers drill in a shaded corner. The clanging of a blacksmith's hammer is heard. Midday. The sun is unbearable. The fortress becomes still. Life retreats indoors into the cool, thick-walled stone buildings. The guards on the towers stand under canvas awnings. The camels rest, chewing cud. It is a quiet, oppressive, shimmering heat. Afternoon. A new caravan is spotted, a line of dust on the western horizon. The tower watchman signals. The garrison prepares. This is a small local caravan, bringing supplies from a coastal port. Dried fish, dates, and perhaps a new amphora of Greek wine for the fortress commander. Evening. The sun dips and the temperature plummets. The main event. The gates are secured. Small cooking fires are lit. The smell of roasting goat and baking flatbread mixes with the ever-present scent of camel and the background perfume of the frankincense stored in the warehouse. In the barracks, soldiers gamble with Roman coins. In a private quarter, the Roman merchant sips his wine from his terra sigillata cup, writing a report on a piece of papyrus. This was life at Shisar. It was not a life of luxury. It was a life of purpose, strategy, and harsh conditions. It was a tough, functional, and immensely wealthy outpost. It was a city built on two foundations. First, the literal, geological foundation of limestone, which held its precious water. And second, the economic foundation of the frankincense trade. For 3 centuries, both foundations held firm. But both, as it turned out, were fragile, and both were about to crack.
A city, like a living thing, can be built to last. It can be fortified against raiders and positioned to profit from trade. But a city, like a living thing, is also fragile. It can die. The city at Shisar, the great logistical hub of the frankincense trade, was built on 2 foundations. The first foundation was economic, the insatiable, multi-century demand for frankincense from the Roman Empire. This was its purpose. The second foundation was geological, the solid limestone bedrock riddled with caves that held its one indispensable resource, the well. This was its lifeline. In the 4th century AD, in a perfect storm of historical change, both of these foundations crumbled at the exact same time. This is the story of the Great Encroachment. It was not a single dramatic event, not the mythical divine sandstorm that buried Iram of the pillars. It was something far more real and far more relentless. It was a slow, 2-front collapse, one economic, the other physical. The first encroachment was economic. It began not in the deserts of Arabia, but 2,000 miles away in the palaces of Rome and the new city of Constantinople. For centuries, the entire business model of Shisar rested on a single reliable customer, pagan Rome. The state religion of the Roman Empire, with its vast pantheon of gods, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Minerva, ran on ritual. And the smell of that ritual was frankincense. In every temple, on every holy day, at every public festival, priests burned frankincense by the ton. It was the scent of piety, the medium of prayer, the perfumum, through smoke, by which mortals communicated with the gods. Pliny the Elder had complained about the staggering cost, but the empire paid.
This demand made the 1,200-mile journey across the empty quarter profitable. The danger, the logistics, the cost, all of it was justified because the customer in Rome would pay any price. Then the customer changed his mind, or more accurately, the customer changed his God. The change began with Emperor Constantine. In 313 AD, with the Edict of Milan, he legalized Christianity. In the decades that followed, he poured imperial funds into building churches, not temples. This was the first wobble in the market. But the final, fatal blow came from Emperor Theodosius I. In 380 AD, Theodosius made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This was not just a promotion for a new faith, it was a demotion for the old one. And Theodosius wasn't finished. Between 391 and 392 AD, he issued a series of devastating decrees. He banned all pagan sacrifice. He ordered pagan temples to be closed. He even made it illegal to practice simple, private pagan rituals, like burning incense to the lares, or household gods. In the span of a single generation, the primary use for frankincense went from being a state-sponsored religious necessity to being a state-banned, illegal act. The frankincense market did not decline. It collapsed. It fell off a cliff. Imagine a modern company built entirely on manufacturing one single product, and overnight, the government of your only customer makes that product illegal. The complex supply chain stretching from the mountains of Oman through the fortress at Shisar, across the 1,200 miles of desert to the ports of Gaza, simply disintegrated. There was no one to pay. The Roman merchants in Shisar's courtyard, the ones who had traded silver coins for resin, packed their belongings and went home. The caravan masters, realizing no one would pay for their next journey, unsaddled their camels. The Yobarite garrison, the soldiers who guarded the walls, stopped receiving payment. The economic encroachment was complete. The fortress at Shisar had lost its purpose. It was now a fortress guarding nothing, a trading post with no trade, a very, very remote and very expensive water well. It was an entity on life support, and it was at that exact moment that the ground gave way. The second encroachment was physical. It was geological, and its cause was the city's own success. The entire reason Shisar existed was its well. But this well was not a simple hole dug into dirt. The fortress was built on a karst. This is a geological formation where water has, over millions of years, dissolved the underlying limestone, creating a vast system of underground caves and caverns. The well at Shisar was a tap drilled into the roof of one of these enormous water-filled caves. For centuries, this system was stable, but the fortress put it under two unbearable strains. The first strain was weight. The garrison built a massive fortress with thick stone walls and a tall central tower directly on top of this geologically hollow ground. The second strain was water use. This was not a small village well. This was an industrial-scale water depot. Think of the prime we just witnessed. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of camels in a single caravan, each one drinking 25 to 50 gallons of water to prepare for the desert crossing. Add to that the needs of the garrison, the merchants, and the local workers. For 300 to 400 years, the fortress drew enormous quantities of water from the well. This had a critical, unseen effect. They were lowering the water table. Inside a water-filled cave, the water itself provides hydrostatic pressure. It pushes up on the ceiling, helping to support its weight. When you pump the water out, that support is gone. The ceiling of the cave, now dry, must support itself and the massive stone fortress built on top of it. For decades, the rock held, but it was fatally weakened.
It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Sometime in the 4th or early 5th century AD, the archaeological dating is not precise to the year, but it is precise to the era. The roof collapsed. The archaeologists, led by Dr. Juris Zarins, found the undeniable proof. They found the walls of the central tower, the very heart of the fortress that once protected the well, at the bottom of the sinkhole. It wasn't a slow settling, it was a sudden, catastrophic structural failure. The ground opened up, and the center of the fortress, the well, and the people in it plunged into the darkness. This was not a mythical punishment from a god. This was a physical consequence of geology and engineering. The fortress, in the end, was too heavy, and its thirst was too great. This is the perfect storm. We must ask which came first. Did the economy collapse, leaving the fortress mostly abandoned when the ground finally gave way? Or did the well collapse first, a sudden catastrophe that destroyed the city's only asset, thereby killing the last vestige of the trade? The archaeological record, by dating the collapse to the exact same period as the economic crash, suggests the most devastating and logical answer. They happened at the same time. Imagine the scene. The fortress is already in a deep depression. The trade has slowed to a trickle. The walls are poorly maintained. The garrison is skeletal. The great caravans no longer arrive. The Roman merchants are gone. The place is a shadow of its former self, haunted by the memory of wealth. And then, one night, the ground opens up. The well, the city's last fading symbolic lifeline, is destroyed. This was the end. The physical collapse was not a tragedy that struck a thriving city. It was the final, brutal punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence of decline. If the frankincense trade had still been booming, they might have tried to rebuild, to dig a new well. But why would they? The customers were gone. There was no reason to rebuild. It was, in every sense, over. The survivors, the last members of the Iobarite, did what any sensible person would do. They walked away. Now the third and final encroachment begins, the great encroachment of the desert itself. The city was not, as the myth of Irem suggests, buried in a single divinely sent 8-day storm. It was buried by 1,500 years of normal weather. For a millennium and a half, the wind blew. Every day it carried fine grains of sand and dust. This is the slow, patient work of the desert. It is the real encroachment. The sand drifted against the abandoned walls. It piled in the corners. It filled the empty barracks. It slowly, inch by inch, covered the catastrophic scar of the sinkhole. The desert, which this fortress was built to defy, was now its custodian. The wind and the sand swallowed the walls, smoothed the sharp edges, and reduced the fortress to a series of gentle, unassuming mounds in the sand. The city was gone. The name Ubar faded from maps and ledgers, surviving only as a whisper in the texts of Ptolemy and in the oral traditions of the Bedouin, who still knew that a road led to something. Shisar, the great fortified machine, was finally and completely asleep.
When the public hears archaeology, they often imagine a dusty chest flung open to reveal a cascade of gold coins and glittering jewels. This is the Hollywood version. It is a story of treasure. History, real history, is not about treasure. It is about data. The true treasure of an excavation is not gold. It is, more often than not, garbage. It is the broken pot, the discarded animal bone, the lost coin, the rusted nail. It is the everyday refuse of life, the things people left behind without a second thought. Because in these discarded fragments, a patient story is written. The artifacts from Shizr, the site we've been excavating, are not the stuff of legend. They are the stuff of fact. They are the small, quiet, boring pieces of evidence that, when assembled, shout the truth of what this place was. The team led by archaeologist Dr. Juris Zarens did not find a king's ransom. They found something far better, an entire, verifiable economic history. Let us begin with the most important and most common of all archaeological finds, pottery. To a historian, pottery, or ceramics, is the single most valuable artifact. It is durable, so it survives for millennia. It is breakable, so people threw it away often. And, most critically, its styles, materials, and manufacturing techniques change over time and vary by location. Pottery is an index fossil for human culture. You can read it like a clock, and you can read it like a map. The archaeologists at Shizr found two main categories of pottery. First, they found the local wares. This is the boring stuff. Simple, unadorned, thick-walled cooking pots, water jugs, and storage jars. They were made from local clay, using traditional methods. And this boring pottery is vital. It tells us that people were living here full-time. They were cooking meals. They were storing water. They were supporting a permanent garrison. This wasn't just a campsite. It was a home, a barracks, a functional fortress. But it was the second category of pottery that blew the case wide open. The team found hundreds of shards that were not local. This is a fragment of Roman terra sigillata. This may be the single most important type of artifact found at the site. Terra sigillata, or stamped earth, was the fine, mass-produced red gloss tableware of the Roman Empire. This was the nice china of its day, made in factories in Gaul and Italy and shipped by the millions of units to every corner of the Roman world. Finding a piece of it in a remote desert outpost in southern Arabia is the first-century equivalent of finding a discarded Starbucks cup at a research station in Antarctica. It is a direct, physical, and undeniable link. It tells us that Romans, or at least people fully participating in the Roman economy, were at Shizr. They were sitting in this fortress, eating or drinking from Roman-made cups. These were the merchants, the agents, the buyers, just as Pliny the Elder had described. And it wasn't just Rome. The team also found fragments of Parthian and later Sasanian pottery. This was the fine, blue-green glazed ware from the other great superpower of the ancient world, the Persian Empire. Shizr was not just a Roman outpost. It was an international crossroads, a place where the two great rival empires of the world, Rome and Persia, met, not for war, but for trade. The pottery on its own confirms that Shizr was a wealthy, international commercial hub, active at the exact time the frankincense trade was at its peak, from the 1st to the 4th centuries AD. The second major category of artifact is coinage. If pottery is the clock, coins are the calendar. They are, quite literally, dated evidence. An ancient ruler would mint coins with his own face and name on them. If you find a coin of Emperor Trajan, you know with absolute certainty that your archaeological layer dates to after Trajan came to power. The dig at Shizr yielded a small but critical collection of coins. They found Roman coins. They found Parthian coins. They found South Arabian coins from the kingdoms in neighboring Yemen. This collection confirms the story the pottery told. This was a multi-currency economy. A Roman merchant could, perhaps, pay for a shipment of frankincense using Roman denarii. A Parthian trader might use his silver drachms. The local Yobarite garrison, in turn, would accept these foreign currencies because they knew they had value. This is not a treasure of gold. This is a ledger, a handful of corroded bronze and silver discs that prove, beyond any doubt, that Shizr was a monetized, high-stakes, international trading post. The team also found other, quieter pieces of the puzzle. They found Roman glass, fragments of small bottles, unguentaria, and cups likely from the workshops of Syria or Alexandria. Like the terra sigillata, glass was a Roman luxury. It was fragile. Transporting it 1,200 miles by camel across a desert was difficult and expensive. This tells us about the quality of life for the fortress commanders. They were not just roughing it in, they were importing the finer things. They found metal objects, iron arrowheads and spear points, confirming the military nature of the site. This was a garrison designed to protect the trade from bandits. They found bronze tools, nails, and simple jewelry like bracelets, the common everyday items of a permanent settlement.
And then they found the eco-facts, the boring stuff that tells us the most about daily life. They found animal bones, thousands of them. When analyzed, they showed the diet of the garrison, primarily goat and sheep, with a surprising amount of camel. They were eating their own transport. They also found bones of fish, which had to be imported, dried, and salted from the coast 100 miles away. They found plant remains. Carbonized date pits were everywhere. Dates were the staple, high-energy food of the desert, just as they are today. And then, the smoking gun. In the collapsed remains of what was identified as a storage room, archaeologists found it. Lumps of ancient, hardened, crystallized resin. It was frankincense. This was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. This was the product. This was the reason for the pottery, the coins, the glass, the garrison, and the fortress itself. They had found the product in the warehouse of the trading post that sat at the junction of the trade routes from the region named by the Roman writers. The case was closed. But there is one final artifact, an artifact that is perhaps the most intriguing, and the one that touches, in the most sleeping history way, on the very myth we have been trying to avoid, Iram of the Pillars. We as historians have dismissed the myth. We are following the facts. But the name of the myth is specific, Iram of the Pillars. Why? Was it just poetry? Or was it a distorted, centuries-old memory of a real physical feature? When Dr. Zarine's team was excavating the central, collapsed building, the one that fell into the sinkhole, they found something architecturally unique. They found the components of a pillar. It was not a simple one-piece column. It was a sophisticated, three-part composite pillar, a square base, a central drum, and a stepped capital on top. This is not a wow moment until you realize this style of architecture is completely alien to this region. It is not Roman, it is not Persian, it is not local Omani. The closest parallel, archaeologists noted, was from the powerful ancient kingdoms of South Arabia in modern-day Yemen, the civilization that for a time had controlled the frankincense trade. This single, anomalous, sophisticated pillar, and there were likely more like it, would have been a stunning, exotic, and memorable feature in an otherwise plain, functional desert fortress. It was a sign of status, a connection to the high culture of the great South Arabian kingdoms. Now, let us think like a historian. We are not saying this is Iram of the Pillars. We are not saying the myth is true. We are suggesting a hypothesis, a logical, evidence-based hypothesis. Imagine a Bedouin traveler in the 3rd century AD. He visits this fortress, the most powerful and important site for hundreds of miles. And the thing he remembers, the thing he tells his children about, is not the boring mud-brick barracks. He remembers the strange, foreign, and impressive pillars in the central court. For the next 1,500 years, the story is told. The city, which was real, collapses. Its location is lost. Its name, Ubar, fades into legend. But the one specific architectural detail that made it famous, the pillars, survives in the oral tradition. The fortress of the Ubarites becomes the place with the pillars. Over centuries of retelling,
This kernel of truth, this archaeological fact, is wrapped in a thick cocoon of myth. It becomes Iram, the city of the pillars. The artifact, the pillar, is not proof of the myth. The myth is the proof of the artifact. It is the distorted cultural echo of a real, unique architectural feature that the archaeologists finally uncovered. The artifacts of Shisar do not tell a story of magic or giants or divine retribution. They tell a story of commerce, logistics, geology, and human ingenuity. They are the puzzle pieces, and when assembled, they give us not the golden city of our imagination, but something far, far more valuable, the real, complex, and human city of our history.
We began this story with a whisper of a magnificent city, Iram of the Pillars, built by giants and destroyed by a divine wind for its arrogance, a myth, an Atlantis of the sands. But when we followed the real evidence, the quiet whispers of data, we found something else. We found a truth that is, in its own way, far more compelling. The ruins you see here at the archaeological site of Shisar in Oman are not the remains of a mythical Iram. The academic consensus is clear. This is the real historical site that gave birth to the legend. This is the place the Bedouin called Ubar. The city at Shisar was not a city of giants. It was a city of humans, hardy, ingenious, practical humans. It was not a vast metropolis, but a compact, formidable fortress, a machine built for a single purpose, to control the only reliable water source for 100 miles and to monopolize the most valuable luxury good in the ancient world. This was the logistical heart of the frankincense trade. It was the concrete historical reality behind Pliny's economic complaints and Ptolemy's geographical data. For centuries, this small outpost at the edge of the empty quarter was a critical node connecting the Roman Empire to the farthest corners of Arabia. Its end was not a divine 8-day sandstorm. Its end was a perfect storm of history and geology. The city died a death of two cuts. First, the economic encroachment. In the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire adopted Christianity. The new state religion, in a series of decrees, banned pagan sacrifice. The market for frankincense, the very reason for Shisar's existence, collapsed. The city lost its purpose. Second, the physical encroachment. At this very same time, the fortress, built too heavily on hollow limestone and weakened by its own industrial-scale use of the well, collapsed into the earth. The well, its one irreplaceable asset, was destroyed in a catastrophic sinkhole. It was not buried by a myth. It was bankrupted by history and swallowed by geology. The story of Shisar is, perhaps, the perfect embodiment of sleeping history. The truth was not found by a treasure hunter seeking a city of gold. It was found by a documentarian, by NASA scientists reading satellite data, and by patient archaeologists with trowels and brushes. They followed the data. They followed the roads. The desert, in the end, did not destroy the city. It simply covered it. It held it in suspension for 1,500 years. The sand that encroached was not a punisher. It was a patient preserver. It waited for us to find the right tools and the right questions to ask it to share its secrets. What we found was not a morality tale, but a human one. A story of ingenuity, commerce, and the profound fragility of everything we build on foundations that one day may shift beneath us. Thank you for listening to Sleeping History.